Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Actionable Truth Podcast. I'm Michael Ginsburg. In this episode, I'm joined by two ladies from the UK, Debi Evans and Sandi Adams. Debi and Sandi will discuss some of their personal experiences at UK Colum, a long-running independent media outlet in the UK, celebrating 2 decades of operation this year. As I covered in my recent piece, which I will link in the show notes below, in early 2025, there was a change in the ownership structure of UK Colum, following the acquisition of a 20% stake in the outlet by a Hong Kong registered corporate entity called YMS Market Access Limited, which was determined to be controlled by a German national by the name of Marcel Yanka. Debi and Sandi both worked at UK Colum throughout this period and will share their experience of how things changed at the outlet following the change in ownership, as well as what lessons can be learned from this entire event for other media outlets of such nature, especially in the alternative media space. So let me just bring them to the stage. Hi, Debi. Hi, Sandi. Thanks for coming on.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. All right. So, but for the benefit of viewers and listeners outside the UK, can you please explain what UK Colum is, and I guess how significant is its role in the independent or alternative media space in the UK?
Debi, you'd be best to answer that. You worked there for much longer than I did. I only managed a year. Go ahead.
Well, for me, I guess I can say that I became aware of the agenda through COVID, or just before COVID anyway. And I wasn't really familiar with alternative media, the whole concept of an alternative media, until I went to do a talk for the wonderful late Ian R. Crane about water, of all things, and my experiences with water. And that's when I met Brian Gerrish. And I'd seen UK Colum on a number of occasions. So I was a little bit starstruck when I met Brian. And he liked the work I did, and we stayed in contact. And of course, as I stayed in contact, I became much more familiar with the alternative media, the whole arena, because it blew up. In COVID, all of a sudden, people like many of us were watching the BBC, Sky, mainstream legacy media, unaware that this explosion of alternative media was happening. And UK Colum certainly were amongst that explosion. And I think when COVID happened and the lockup, as I call it, or lockdown happened, I was working voluntarily for UK Colum for 18 months because Brian had met me when I'd been talking about water, my experiences with water and sewer flooding. So I'd been working behind the scenes, off camera, very quietly, unpaid, as a volunteer for 18 months, and watched the growth of UK Colum, because everybody seemingly was looking and joining the column purely to find out what was going on with COVID and the lockup and just pretty much everything. So that was how I got into it and how I became aware of alternative media. And since working at
just a question, Debi. So obviously, I mean, UK Colum has been around for a long time. They've been around for 2 decades, right? So would it be accurate to say that they were kind of like, simmering in the background for like a long time? And then obviously COVID came and they just blew up.
Absolutely. They started off as a paper publication.
Right.
And Mike Robinson and Brian Gerrish, who were the founders, and David Scott, the 3 directors, they were doing their own thing in the background, and they were pretty successful at what they did, very much reliant on voluntary help. And then in COVID, it just literally exploded and took off. So yeah, I would say you're absolutely right.
So common story. Okay. All right. Anything from you to Sandi to add?
Well, only that during this time, I was already an independent researcher. I had my own profile, and I was asked several times to come on the column and to contribute to content, which I did. I worked alongside Debi on 2 quite big sort of 3-hour content, sort of expanded what we call long form content. One was on Agenda 2030 with Brian, and the other one was Dear Farmer with Debi. So I'd known Brian Gerrish for 15 years, and I thought he was a friend, a bit like Debi. I mean, I didn't really get on very well with Mike Robinson. I didn't have much to do with him, but certainly Brian had been, because Brian was the original guy that set it all up. And I knew it when it was a newspaper, and we used to collaborate sometimes on talks and do talks, in the UK together. And I thought, I really valued him as a friend. But things did change quite rapidly, didn't they, Debi?
We'll get to that. I guess just to give people full context. So for each of you, so for Debi and Sandi, what was your actual what were your roles with UK Colum? What were you doing? Were you presenters, or what were you doing?
Well, so originally for me, I'm a nurse, right? So I've got nothing to do with journalism. I'm not a journalist. I'm not qualified to be a journalist. Yeah. So I was a gobby granny nurse, old school nurse. And when I first started talking to Brian Gerrish through talking about water, as Sandi said, I genuinely thought he was my friend. Genuinely, older gentleman, our generation, very polite. I genuinely thought he was our friend. For the first 18 months, I was working behind the scenes, unpaid, just as a volunteer, feeding Brian information about COVID. But I think it got so complicated. There was a lot of medical terminology. There was a lot of medical speak. And in the end, he persuaded Mike Robinson, who I had never met. I'd only ever had contact with Brian. Mike was much, he seemed a colder fish than Brian. He was never very friendly. He was never very social. So I understood that Brian had to fight to get me on screen. I didn't really want to go on screen, to be fair. I was quite happy just behind the screen and not getting paid. That wasn't my issue. My issue was getting the news out, really, through Brian. So eventually he persuaded me. He'll tell you otherwise. He'll tell you that I was desperate to join UK Colum. He'll tell you all sorts of things, but I can tell you that he persuaded me to join the team. And it was a big decision for me, which I won't go into now, but it was a big decision. But he persuaded me to go in as a junior presenter, which is what I understood I would be doing, contributing once a week on the news. And that was it.
Right. Okay. So let's get just the timeline straight so that everything is clear. So you started originally with UK Colum when?
Probably around 2019, 2020, just as all of this was starting.
Okay.
Because I'd spoken at Ian R. Crane's Alternative View, which is where I'd met Brian. So I'd kind of fed them information, kept feeding them information until probably about 2021. And that's when Brian was starting to try to get me on the column. And I was there total, I reckon, for just under 2 years. So I got booted out. I got unceremoniously booted out in January 2025.
Okay, so you got involved with UK Colum in early 2020, and when did you start being a presenter, in front of the camera? When you kind of moved to the front of the camera?
I should have looked at the dates, really, shouldn't I? But it was probably back in 2021, early 2022, something like that.
So fairly quickly. Okay.
I did about a year voluntary work with them. I think it took Brian about a year, 15 months to persuade Mike Robinson to put me on screen.
Got it. Okay. All right. What about you, Sandi? So again, whatever timelines you remember.
The timelines I remember is I'd worked, as I said, for voluntarily and done some long form stuff. And in fact, I just finished a series with Debi that I did for three hours series on farming and the destruction of farming and food production in the UK. and that was around, we did the final one around, it must have been January 2024. We finished the final one, or maybe it was
2025.
2020. Well, was it 2020? No, it was 2024. It was before...
December. It would probably, we did Dear Farmer around November, December 2024, because I was booted out in January 2025.
Yeah, and I remember finishing that series with you and thinking, and gosh, you know, that was really good, and it'd be nice to work a bit more. But I was doing my own thing, and I was writing a book, and so I wasn't thinking about taking a full-time job. But having said that, it would have been, you know, when Brian finally called me in February 2025. He called me, it was January 2025, the end of January 2025. It must have been probably around the very beginning of February. I can't quite remember. It was either late January or beginning of February. And he asked me if I'd like to come and work as a presenter. And it was a bit of a shock, really, because he'd never asked me before, and I've been around for a long time. And so I said, well, I'll think about it. And then I thought about it, and I went back to him and I said, yeah, I could do that. That's great. So he said, oh, come down to the office and have a chat with us all. So it was all going to be a very informal chat. But as it happened, you see, I had no idea that they'd sacked Debi. They didn't say a word. And I said to Brian, when he offered me the job, oh, it'd be great to work with Debi again. And he just went quiet. And so I got down to Plymouth for this chat, and it was a very uncomfortable experience because Brian was nowhere to be seen. He had gone somewhere else that day and didn't tell me. I think he told me at the last minute, oh, I won't be there, when I was on my way down. And so I sat with Charles Malet and Mike Robinson, and it was like an interrogation, really. It was the first thing they said to me is, what did Brian tell you? And I said, well, he's offered me a job. And they looked at each other as if they didn't know. And I said, did you not know? And they wouldn't answer. And it was so uncomfortable. It was really awful. And I was in there for about an hour, and they just kind of interrogated me about who in the truth movement did I think was controlled opposition. And that went on for a while. And then I said, look, have I got a job or not? Because I'm still a bit in the dark. And they said, yeah, you're going to start on Wednesday. No training, nothing. It was I'd never ever done live broadcasting before, other than my own podcasts and stuff like that. So I just thought, right, okay, I had to learn a whole new system, all the slight, you know what it's like, Debi. You're thrown in at the deep end. So I managed to do it, but I realised that when I started, it was a very unhappy ship. The whole office was not a very happy ship, and they'd employed this lady called Gemma Cooper, who was the one that brought Marcel Yanka to the column, and they'd employed her as a producer. And I didn't
get to Marcel Yanka. I just want, I want a little bit of a timeline. So okay, I think probably the next question, you'd be best positioned to answer, Debi, because I think you've been, by the sound of it, you've been at UK Colum a lot longer than Sandi.
Yeah.
So I guess, when did you start noticing that, there were some changes in the outlet, be it editorial stance or standards, facilities, programming, things like that?
Well, immediately Charles Malet was appointed. That's when I started seeing it, right from the get-go, with Brian and Mike.
Which was when? It
was probably, I started to notice a big difference as we were going into the new studio. We were rebels. We used to call ourselves rebels in a shoebox. And there was Mike Robinson, Brian Gerrish, David Scott, who were the three directors, and then a few of us presenters. And we were in a tiny, tiny little office in Plymouth. And then we decided that we were going to, or at least the directors decided they were going to go to a bigger office. And that was in, I think, June 2024, something like that. Now, just prior to that, this chap had arrived at the UK Colum office out of nowhere, supposedly, called Charles Malet. I didn't know who he was, but I had a phone call from somebody within the office to say, oh gosh, guess what? This chap has arrived, and he's very sort of, sounds like he's part of the elite, and he's arrived at the office and he's offering all sorts of things to the column and talking to Brian and Mike. And I went, oh, right, didn't think anything of it. But in July, when we moved offices to a big office in Plymouth, and Charles suddenly appeared, because he disappeared for a little while, and all of a sudden he appeared again. And the minute he appeared,
So that's
I had
June, July
started red
2024,
flags.
yes?
But yeah, probably
Okay.
around as soon as we moved office, as soon as
Okay.
I saw him, I met him for the first time in what I call an antisocial. We were invited to a social event, a staff social event in a pub near Plymouth, and it was an absolute disaster. It was an antisocial. And I met Charles there properly, and I noted how quiet he was, and he wasn't giving any information about himself, but he was sucking up information about everybody else, and I felt uncomfortable with it. And I aired this to a couple of members of staff, and I said, I'm not feeling right about Charles Malet. There's something off. I don't know what it is, but my spider senses were screaming at me. So I did a load of research on him, which didn't go down very well. And I found out things that I felt uncomfortable with, and I wanted to ask questions. And it took me a while, but we were never told, the staff were never told, that Charles Malet had been appointed as a director of UK Colum because David Scott had left, and therefore there was a position going. Now, we were never told at the time that Charles Malet had taken on the post, that he was a director. We still believed that he was a junior presenter. He'd been shipped in as a junior presenter to talk about the police because he'd handed in his resignation from the police. That's what we were told. That wouldn't now appear to be the truth, because behind our backs, despite what those at the column might say, because they'll tell you that they told us that he was a director, I can tell you 100% they did not tell us that he'd been appointed as a director.
Okay,
And
all
then
right. Sorry, let me just stop you there. So let's put Charles Malet aside. So you said that kind of you started noticing changes as soon as Malet came on board in June, July. So let's say mid 2024. So what was the nature of the changes? Now let's forget about the person. What started happening? And you've been at UK Column for a while, like up until that point. So you could tell, like if there were some major changes happening. What were those changes?
The changes that I noticed were that he was traveling quite a long distance to be in the UK Column office to present, which we normally did it remotely. I used to have very regular chats with Brian Gerrish, never any chats with Mike Robinson. He wasn't really a chatty sort of a chap, but Brian would phone me pretty much every night for the news and what I was doing and where I was going to go for the next story. And he kept saying how amazing Charles was, how incredible Charles was, what a lot of help that Charles was giving him. And then one night he rang me up and he said, guess where I'm going? And I said, where are you going? And he said, I'm going to go and do a talk at Eton. I'm going to talk to a class of boys at Eton. And it didn't comprehend in my head. And I said, how did you manage to do that? And he said, oh, Charles is getting me into Eton. And I'm thinking, well, should we have 5-minute texts from you to make sure that you're safe, Brian? Because for me, it was like he was going into Hogwarts pretty much. And I said, you're going behind enemy lines. Do we need to check that you're okay? And he laughed it off, but he was really buoyed up with the fact that he was going to be doing this interview or doing this presentation to a class of boys at Eton. And that set me off as well. And Charles just managed to maneuver himself further and further in, and to excluding the presenters and taking much more of a role, an everyday role that I couldn't work at. Because remember, at this time, we hadn't been told he was a director. So
Right.
We didn't know why he was taking on such a huge role when he'd only just appeared.
Okay, all right. So again, let's move away from the personnel. So in terms of what was the kind of the public facing face of UK Column. So that means content. That means how studios looked, how the presentation was, how maybe was the style of presentation. So anything, forget about the personnel for a second, anything that is kind of audience facing, because you could you were there for a while up until that point. What has changed? Could be changes in I guess editorial stance, editorial policy, maybe perceived editorial bias, new studios, new facilities, new programming, stuff like that.
All of that, all of that.
Okay, so let's talk about that.
new studio, and because we were in a shoebox, and we went to this beautiful 2-story studio, which was obviously going to be very expensive. So it was obviously we were expanding content.
And when did the new studio happen?
At the same time as Charles Malet suddenly reappeared.
Second half of 2024.
Yeah, second half of 2024. And as far as I know, Charles wasn't involved in any, because David Scott was an engineer. So he was instrumental in making sure that the studio became a studio and it wasn't just an office. Right. So green screens were put in, soundproofing was put in, beam structure had to be, it was very complex. So David Scott did all of that. So it wasn't until we moved from the shoebox to the big office that Charles then reappeared, and then miraculously David disappeared. So that was a big change. That was a massive change. The office itself was a massive change. We now had a UK Colum logo above the office, which we'd never had before. We had content. It was interesting because I'd always tried to talk about the Kalergi plan and was closed down, shut down straight away. I also tried to talk about the secret Chinese police stations that were operating in the UK. That was shut down straight away. I'd also voluntarily produced a 6-part series. Well, it was going to be longer than that, actually, about King Charles and the Green King. And my last episode of that, which I did voluntarily, it got censored and it never got shown because I was exposing characters from Eton. So that got shut down too. And then we noticed that in the Bristol conference, which was the first conference that UK Colum had held, which was, from my point of view, a complete disaster for other reasons. But in the Bristol conference, Charles Malet took over the whole as master of ceremonies. So he ran the whole thing and took charge, which we couldn't work out because we thought he was a junior presenter, right? We didn't know he was a director. They hadn't told us. But we were ordered about during the conference. And then in the November, we find out that Charles is in Hong Kong. And we're thinking, what? We've got a presenter now presenting live from Hong Kong.
So that's November 2024, yes?
Yeah, November. I think it was October, November 2024. Okay. All of a sudden, Charles Malet is broadcasting from Hong Kong. We didn't know why. We couldn't work out why is he in Hong Kong. We were told he was on holiday, but it seemed strange that a man with his wife and 2 children would go on a 3-week holiday to Hong Kong because it's, you maybe take your children to a safari park or to Disney or whatever, but to stay for 3 weeks. So we were suspicious. I was suspicious then. So all of these little things, these little changes started adding up to massive, great big red flags in my head.
Okay. All right. So that's so there's a lot of good stuff here, especially around some of the content that was kind of became taboo. So, okay. So Sandi, so by mid 2024, you were already on board, you were already at UK Colum?
Yeah, I mean, I started, as I say, I started in February 2025.
Okay.
2025, that's when I started, and I had no idea that Debbie had left. When I finally did start, I realised that Debbie wasn't around. She seemed to have left the news. And I asked a few questions, and I was told, oh, Debbie's unlikely to come back in the near future. There was big secrecy around where Debbie was. And I thought it was all a bit odd, but I just cracked on and got on with it. And and then they did announce that she'd been let go of, and I was quite shocked. But anyway,
that was the same time that you came on board. So that was around February 2025. Was that when you were let go, Debbie?
I was let go. Strangely, as Sandi's talking, I was let go on January the 30th, 2024, and I think Sandi was probably approached within hours. 2025, sorry. Yeah. And I think Sandi was approached literally within hours of me being sacked. Yeah. And that's what happened. I want to clarify that because UK Colum said that I'd left. I didn't leave. I got sacked.
Yeah. Okay. And I found it interesting that they didn't want to talk about it. And I thought they'd ask me, to join them on the back of Dear Farmer, which was this series we'd done together. And I didn't think for a minute she would have gone. It was literally I'd been working with her a couple of weeks beforehand. So I just thought it was, I'm joining because of Dear Farmer, and they liked it. I don't know. But anyway, I joined, and I suddenly realized how what an unhappy, office it was. There were lots of there's no communication at all. And I was working remotely. I wasn't in the office. I was working remotely, and you just get fed a little bit of information, and then you're supposed to come up with your content the morning of the show. You're supposed to come up with it, organize it all. It's very stressful situation. And then sometimes, they'd say, well, you're not allowed to talk about this, and you're not allowed to talk about that, particularly anything to do with China. And so,
okay, that's important. Who told you that? Who told you that you cannot talk about anything related to China? Who told you?
I'll tell you, it all started when Mike Robinson came to the showing of a film that I'd been involved in called The Agenda, Your Life in Their Hands, directed by Mark Sharman. And I'd been quite involved in that with content, and I did a little cameo in it. And what happened is that Mike Robinson was invited to the showing of that film in April, the 11th of April, 2025. Yeah. After I was working for them in April. And he came and he watched the whole film. And then right at the end, he said, I can't have anything to do with this film. I'm not going to launch it. And Mark Sharman said, well, what's the problem? And he said, it's Aman Jabi at the end talking about Chinese social credit system. And so Mark Sharman said, well, what's wrong with that? This is what we're heading to in worldwide, and particularly in the UK. We're heading towards Chinese social credit system. And Mike went ballistic and said, absolutely not. There's no such thing as Chinese social credit system. And I said, well, what about the Zima system? It actually exists. And he said, no, it doesn't. There's no such thing. And he said, I've been to China, and it's free. It's wonderful. There's no social credit. When I went there with my family, and he'd gone there a few months before, he said, we used cash the whole time, and there was no surveillance cameras. It was wonderful. And we were all sitting there going, you sure? Anyway, he refused to launch that film. And I then said, look, could I launch it on the news? Could I just show the trailer? And they reluctantly said yes. They let me show the trailer on the news. And I realized then that there was I realized that there was something really strange why he was defending China.
Okay, all right. This is a significant point. So I want it to be really, really clear, and that there's no room for any misunderstanding.
Yeah.
So during the screening, Mike Robinson said that he will not launch the documentary because, from his perspective, it contained a falsehood, which, from his perspective, he said that there is no such thing as a social credit score in China. And he said, because of that, I don't want to be associated with that film. Okay? People can decide for themselves what they think about it, but that is one thing.
Yeah.
How do we move from that to basically a directive, either explicit or implicit, that you cannot criticize China on air at UK Colum? That's quite a big, I guess, jump, right? So how do we jump from what you told me to, the conclusion that you cannot criticize China on air at UK Colum?
Well, I had a few things that I wanted to discuss. For instance, the new super embassy that's being built in London. I wanted to talk about that, and I brought it up with Gemma Cooper, one of the producers, and she said, "Don't touch that. You can't talk about the super embassy." So I didn't. I just thought, okay. I wasn't told by Mike or Brian. I was just thrashing ideas around. And
did you ask her why? Did you ask her why you can't talk about that?
She's by that time I knew that they'd got money. That they'd got money in from what they called a British businessman in Hong Kong. I mean, was it a British or a businessman who lives in Hong Kong? And it sounded like it wasn't anything to do with China, because they really pushed the whole Hong Kong thing, thinking that it was somehow better than China. And so and she said, "Oh no, that would upset the investor. You know, the investor
I
is."
see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All
So
right. So let's.
I
Okay.
sort of
So
let.
she told you, so you can't do that because that will upset
Yeah.
the investor. Okay. That is an important point I wanted
Yeah.
to come across. So upset the investor. All right. Now, Debbie, you had an issue when you wanted to cover the Chinese police station, right? And you were kind of barred from doing that. What was the reasoning that was given to you as to why you cannot cover that? Which seems, I mean, this is not even something that is happening in another country. We're not even arguing whether, like, there is or there isn't a social credit score in China. This is like Chinese presence on UK soil, right? So what was the reasoning that was given?
I was given no reason. I kept every day when we were doing the news, we'd have a meeting at
Right.
9 o'clock. And so we would put our news forward and say what was on. And every single week for about 5 or 6 weeks, I put on Chinese police stations. And my producer at the time, Stephanie, she would also push it and say, can we please put the story on about the secret Chinese police stations and the lobbying that was going on in Parliament with the MPs demanding to know what was going on, and also the installation of a Chinese MP in the British Parliament. We do have a Chinese MP, and it just got completely, we'd run over time or something else would happen and the story would get pushed, and then I'd be told, oh, we might be able to do it next week, but next week never came. And in the end it was, no, it's irrelevant, we're not going to push it. So I was never given a definitive.
How many times did you try and raise that story? That is a significant story by any account. At least
six times. And I just got blanked every time. As soon as I tried to mention Kalergi, so when Sandi was talking about the Kalergi plan on UK Column this year, I was shocked because I'd been trying to talk about Kalergi for years, literally, and got absolutely blanked. There was a few things I got censored on, and there was a few interviews that I did that got censored that never got shown.
Okay. All right. Now we have some, like, facts, and people can draw their own conclusions. All right. So we have two matters, right, relating to China. One, definitely, without a shadow of a doubt, of public interest to anyone in the UK. All right. So people can decide, like, and I invite, like, and I definitely hear, and, like, we're recording this, but, like, I invite UK Column to, like, give their version of the story if they, like, you want to counter that. From my perspective, as, like, someone who's not in the UK, hasn't really heard of UK Column up until, like, a few months ago, this seems significant. To me, that seems significant. All right. Okay. All right. So let's, I guess, let's move to, kind of like, the elephant in the room. So when did either of you first hear the name Marcel Yanka, and in what context?
For me personally, I didn't hear his name until after I was sacked, and I did a lot of investigation. I knew that there was a donor. They said that they had a donor in Thailand who was donating, I think, between £2,000 and £3,000 a month as a member. They told me that, but they never mentioned a name. So up until I started to do the research myself after I'd been sacked, I'd never heard his name.
Okay. What about you, Sandy?
I was given his name, funnily enough, by one of the producers, Gemma Cooper. And she mentioned his name, and she said, I'm not allowed to tell you his name, but I will. And she did. And she said...
Did you ask her why she's not allowed to mention his name?
She would get the sack.
Right.
You were also told you'd get the sack if you spoke about me, weren't you?
Oh yes, I was told if I contacted Debi Evans, I would get sacked. That's the same producer told me that too. I said, look, I said, well, I realise now Debi's actually was sacked. Why was she sacked? She said, don't contact Debi. If they find out you've contacted Debi, you will get the sack. And she also, I was inquiring about this investor because I felt that there was some kind of real subterfuge going on, because nobody was allowed to know who he was, where he was. And she told me that he was a German chap who lived in China, or she said, I can't remember. There was some confusion, because I know he's got offices in Hong Kong as well. So they like to call it Hong Kong, but actually he's got offices in Shanghai. But she did say to me, he's got
corporate entities that are registered in Hong Kong. Yes, I don't know if he has a physical presence, but it's definitely a corporate entities, specifically the one that has the stake in UK Colum. I know, because we've seen the documents, and that one is registered in Hong Kong. It's a Hong Kong company.
I believe he's got offices in Shanghai, which, let's face it, is the heart of the CCP. So anyway, I was told if I repeated his name to anyone, and the column found out, I and she would get the sack. So it was really bizarre, and I thought, this is really wrong. So
you were told that by Gemma Cooper, who was your producer at the time, yes?
Yeah, she was the producer, and she had this rather love-hate relationship with the column at that time. I think she's more embedded now, but she had that kind of, she wasn't sure, she didn't like the way they operated. It was a very strange time, because I noticed that at the same time they were bringing in presenters like Carl Czar and Germ Warfare, Jeremy Nell. So and really pushing this whole China's wonderful, going on tours all around China, saying there's no such thing as social credit. And I thought, this kind of ties up with what Robinson was saying at the agenda filming screening, and I thought, this is crazy. They're trying to paint some wonderful picture of China when we all know what China's about. And so I just found it all very counterintuitive to where my views lay. So I found it really difficult, and I could see this propaganda being pushed into the column more. And I think it is interesting about Debbie saying about the Kalergi plan, because I covered that soon after I joined, and they let me do it, which was extraordinary, because it is very controversial, but it is part of the whole, if you like, the Zionist kind of takeover. And the immigration is a massive problem in the UK. And so I did do a couple of bits on immigration, but at the same time, Ben Rubin was dealing with that with Brian on a Monday. So I thought it was okay to deal with immigration, and not in a not pushing it as a racist thing, because it's not, just having that opinion that the volume is too much and it's too quick, and we don't know who they are. It's unregulated immigration, and the crime rates going up and all that sort of thing. So what really hit me, what really made me realize that something was horribly wrong, was in I believe it was June. It was either June or July 2025. I'd been covering quite a bit on immigration, and I knew that what's her name, Vanessa Beeley, didn't like what I was doing. She really didn't like it. She works in Syria. She's very, very into the whole culture there, and she was having a go, really. And Mike Robinson really reveres her. He almost stands on her every word. And she was saying, she didn't like me. She wanted me out because of what I was talking about. And so we had I was always on a Wednesday with Mike, Charles, and Vanessa. And we had this thing called Extra, which was the members paid extra to have a more informal chat with us after the show. And they could have a chat. There was a chat where they could interact with us. And it was a very strange thing, because I was always slightly intimidated by Mike anyway, and to a degree Charles. And in Extra, suddenly he directed the first question at me, which he never did. Usually I was just kind of like, I would comment on things, but they didn't really like me getting involved in the geopolitical stuff. I had to deal with just UK stuff, councils and all that sort of thing, which I was fine with. But anyway, they directed the first question at me. And the first question was, and this really shocked me, Mike said, Sandy, do you think the climate in the UK at the moment, now we're talking sort of summer 2025. So do you think the climate in the UK is a little bit like 1930s Germany? And I said, yeah, pretty much. I mean, we've got a fascist government, we've got no freedom of speech. And I rattled off a few other things. And he said, and he was very derogatory. He said, no, you're not getting it, Sandy. You're not getting it. He said, I'm talking about the migrants in the UK are being treated like the Jews in the 1930s. And I was just, what? I said, well, no, not really. They're coming in illegally onto, through our open borders. Our government is supporting it, and they're being put into 5-star hotels, and the crime rates in the areas where they're going is going up. And we've got a real problem here because the volume is too big. We're an island, we're tiny. And then Vanessa Beeley stoked in and said that I was virtually insinuating I was being racist, and that the people that are coming in are full of love, and that they love this country, and they really are nice people. And I said, look, you don't know that. And anyway, we had this debate, and it was very uncomfortable because they literally rounded on me. And I was made to, Vanessa said something about, I think it was in the extra the next time we did it, was she called me a colonialist. I was being bullied, I was being gaslit. She called me a colonialist thinking woman, and that it was small thinking and all this sort of thing. And also she said that the West has to fall, that the United Kingdom has to go because of the City of London. And I tried to explain, well, the City of London isn't England. The City of London has its own jurisdiction. It is not part of the UK. It's an island, it's a country within a country. And it's been run by the globalists for hundreds of years, not the people of Britain. So don't blame the people of Britain for what the City of London are doing. And she said, and Mike Robinson said, you can't separate the two, Sandy. And he was really awful. And I said, look, we marched against the Iraq war. We marched, our government are working against us. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. England itself, the people of England are absolutely 100% good people who don't want these wars. We didn't want any of those wars. And we also don't want the problem, reaction, solution of the immigration either. And they just rounded on me. And it was like, but what was interesting is the chat.
So there was mainly Mike Robinson and Vanessa Beeley, is that correct?
Yeah, mainly them. And right at the end, I saw Charles Malet being very quiet. And I said, Charles, because Charles, to be fair, he only woke up in 2020, if at all. And then he comes into UK Column as a senior presenter. He knows absolutely nothing. He doesn't understand what's really going on. I think he's very geopolitically naive. And he was out of his depth most of the time. And he just literally steamed in and said, well, you can't go around being mean to brown people or something stupid like that. Or at least he said that to me afterwards. I can't remember. But what happened is that he joined in with them, and he wanted to be on their side because they were the majority, and it was like literally picking on me. But what was interesting is the people in the chat were behind me, and right just before, and I couldn't see it because I was remote. And just before the end of that program, Mike Robinson looked at the chat and he said, there's some very disturbing comments in this chat. And I thought, oh, that's good. That means that they're on my side. And so I closed my computer down at the end of it. And I went and had a lie down thinking, I'm going to hand my notice in. I can't bear that. That was awful. And so I ended up just not doing anything. And then I got a call from Gemma Cooper. And she said, oh, well done, you held your own. That was very good. And the chat were behind you. And they lost a lot of subscribers because of it. And Brian's going mad at Charles now, and at Mike now. She said that, there's a lot of shouting in the office. And you'll probably get a call from Brian later. Well, I didn't get a call from Brian at all. So I just left it. And then at 10:30 that night, I got a call from Mike Robinson. And he was like a little boy. And he said, oh, Sandy, I just want to apologize for what happened today. Okay. And I got it completely wrong. I got it. And I said, listen, I can understand maybe you did get it wrong, but all three of you, I said, that was a planned attack on me. You planned it. You'd all got your script. And I'm sorry, I would like an apology from Vanessa and Charles as well. He said, well, I can't speak for them. So I left it. I did have a bit of a chat with Charles the next day, and he was awful. I mean, he was awful. And I said, okay. Yeah.
All right, Sandy. That's so yeah. I get the picture. So this is obviously internal personnel issues within UK Colum, and that's fine. But I guess from my perspective, it does become public interest, right? If Mike Robinson, right, who's like one of the directors, right, one of the directors of the column, right, if he changed his views, like for example, he had in the past, he held views that uncontrolled immigration is very bad. Immigration from incompatible countries is very bad. And then all of a sudden, maybe he changed his tune. So I don't know. You obviously, you may not be able to comment on that. But I mean, obviously, you, Debbie, you've been at UK Colum a lot longer. Does that seem to you, like based on Sandy's account, does that sound to you like his views have changed? And he held
to me, Mike Robinson, as far as I'm aware, doesn't really hold the UK or certainly England in very high regard, as far as I can make out. And it's interesting because, Sandy was talking there about Gemma Cooper, the producer that had been brought in. She's ex-BBC. One of Mike Robinson's relatives works for the BBC. So I hadn't seen... No, I'd say as far as Mike Robinson was concerned, he's a difficult person to get on with, and he's got very hard and fast views. He's very, very close to Vanessa Beeley, very close. They align their views. I mean, it's almost to the point that nobody can speak to Vanessa unless it's Mike, pretty much. Yes. And he just doesn't like the UK. He's quite open in the fact that...
Yeah. Neither does Vanessa. They both literally think the UK should be destroyed because of the City of London. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. I think we get the picture. So I guess to go back to see if there's anything to add specifically around Marcel Yanka, and I guess from my perspective. So obviously you mentioned Sandy when you first heard about him, but were you told at any point that he was actually like a part owner of UK Colum, that he has an ownership stake in the outlet?
No.
Was any of, I'm assuming that obviously if you didn't know, then the membership wasn't notified that there was like a new owner, or not? Nobody. Okay.
Right. No. And I think really it came, the reason, I mean, I was building up this whole case in my head for leaving. And it really came to a head in December. I think it was December, or no, it was January. Well, it was December, from December to January, 2025 to 2026. And what happened was I got everyone got an invite out to China from Marcel Yanka's office, and it was they called it a Synth Asia project, and his PA Jenny sent an invite to everybody in the UK Colum by email, an invite to a big party in China, and it was a Chinese New Year party, and it was 5 days, and all expenses paid. You were flown out there, put into a hotel. There was a big gala dinner, and you were there sort of meeting people and networking, and it was
Marcel's company or whatever. I mean, they were going to cover all the accommodation, flights, expenses, everything. Okay.
Everything, yeah. And I at first I thought it would be quite interesting to sort of spy on it all. And then I thought, no, I don't think I can do this. I didn't want to spend 5 days. I didn't know who in the office was going to go. As people sort of drifted off, I mean, a couple of people didn't have passports, and a couple of people couldn't go because of commitments and stuff. And it ended up that there was going to be Gemma Cooper Mike Robinson, and Charles were going to go, and one of the boys from the office who was a new intern in the tech side in America. So yeah, there was a couple of people. Anyway, I decided in the end I didn't want them to know that I was thinking of leaving, and I didn't want them to know. So I sent my passport in 3 days late for the visa, and it was too late. And I remember Charles Malet saying, "Oh, you've sent it in too late." I went, "Oh, never mind, eh?" You know. So I didn't go. I didn't want to go. And I realised that actually by going, I could actually compromise myself because I was going to leave, and I didn't want people to think I was, you know, in some way involved with the whole Chinese thing. So whilst they were out it wasn't when they were out there. I handed my notice in on the 12th of January, and I think they went out on the 5th of February to China. And it was really interesting because I remember before I left, one of the producers said to me, they're really panicking because they don't know how they're going to go to China and run the news that week. And I said, well, they're going to have to find a way around it. And they did. I mean, they literally did the news from a hotel room in China. But a lot of the membership was saying, well, what are you doing there? Because they'd framed it. And Brian was quite open about it on the news, saying, thanks to our membership, we've been able to go to China. And thank you to all our subscribers, because you've allowed us to go. And the subscribers were thinking, well, what are we paying for you to go to China for?
So what was, okay, so if that was said on air, what was the reason that was given, like why, like, you know, spend all the, like, you know, member, like, you know, contributions to go to China with all that stuff? So like, what was the reasoning that was given? Like, you know, when they thanked the members, what, like, was there a specific project that were doing? Like, what was the purpose?
They didn't seem to give an explanation.
Okay.
They were just in a hotel room doing the normal news. And so, of course, questions were asked, and people withdrew their membership.
And so was anyone, like, you know, when in the lead up to the China trip, did any of your presenters mention, like, on the news or in any other programs, that they were going to China or anything like that? Or basically it was just when they were already in China, there was a news broadcast, and they said, oh, yep, this news broadcast is from China. Thank you to all the members who basically allowed us to come here and broadcast from China. Is that how it went?
I don't think they did. I mean, I must admit, I did stop watching after I'd left. I think Debbie, I do remember Charles Malet afterwards going to Hong Kong, and I'm not sure what he was doing in Hong Kong, but he was then taken to Hong Kong when everybody else went back home, and they did interview him from Hong Kong. So I can't remember what he was saying and why he was in Hong Kong. Do you remember at all?
No, it was all very the whole thing was very mysterious. The arrival of Charles Malet, the takeover, the whole attitude changed, and I think also what happened, and what I was told by two other people that were working at the column at the time, was that as I was sacked, all of a sudden, literally boxes were coming in through the door every single day with new equipment. And we'd already been told that the column, since the COVID figures had gone up, since the division with the geopolitical situation had split the audience, that we would need that we'd lost members. So I'd always known Mike and Brian to be quite frugal, you know, and to get secondhand equipment and all of a sudden the doors were open, and I was being told by members of staff that were still there that all of this new equipment was arriving, new TV screens. I was also told that the meeting room had changed as well, and that now secret meetings with frosted glass, TV screens moved down. Nobody knew who was on the screen. Nobody could see what was going on in the meeting room anymore. Everything became very secret. And the other thing that I thought was strange was when I was told by one of the members of staff, knowing how frugal Mike had been with equipment, all of a sudden he's giving the old equipment away. It's like he's just giving it away because every single day there are more and more boxes coming through the door with brand new equipment when we're meant to be on a rainy day fund.
So that, when was that?
Struggling.
When did the new equipment and the boxes started coming in daily? When was that, as far as timeline?
As soon as I got dumped, literally, things started to change. Sandy came in, Carl Zar. I'd already predicted.
So late January, early February 2025.
Yes. Yeah, and I mean, what was interesting was I'd already predicted to 2 other members of staff that Carl Zar was going to come in, that Jeremy Nell was going to come in, and that Andrew Wakefield was going to be included. I'd already predicted that, and everybody's going, don't be ridiculous. That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And I'm sadly, I was right. I don't want to be right on these things, but as they happened, Carl Zar was introduced and Jeremy Nell was introduced, and they had their own shows. And then the Andrew Wakefield connection, it was like people were looking at me going, how did you know this? Well, how were you able to predict this? And it was just because of the research that I had done, to the point that Brian Gerrish had said to me, screamed at me down the phone actually, and said, you know too much. And I didn't understand what he meant by that phrase. I thought, well, I'm a researcher. I'm a gobby granny. You know, I spend all of these hours every day nosing to find out what's going. How can you know too much? How can anybody know too much? We're learning every day.
It's a weird statement from someone who runs a media outlet. It's just like, and supposedly independent media. I just find it a bit odd, but hey, maybe that's just me.
I did.
Yeah. Okay.
I did. But then, of course, it turns out that I knew too much about what the plans were moving forward. And that because I was suspicious, I had to be got rid of, because they knew at the end of the day that I couldn't be controlled and that they couldn't control me. But what upset me more than anything, I think, was being dumped in such a ferocious way that I wasn't, because my primary goal for being at the column was the members and the audience. I had a really close affiliation with them. I trusted them and they trusted me, and I had huge amounts of information from the audience. So the fact that people, old age pensioners too, were giving £5 a month, or you maybe a lifetime membership, they were giving their money in good faith. Yeah. That's what upset me even more. And I would never have gone without saying goodbye and thank you to the audience. So the way that I was cut off, and then lots of lies were told, I mean, all sorts of things went on, and lies were told about me, including to Sandy as well. And I just had to sit quietly and do my research because I wanted to know what was going on. But you know, it was just a toxic environment, and everything changed very quickly when the leadership and the directorship changed.
Okay. All right. So I guess the last question is for you, Sandy, because I just kind of want to a little bit understand more the context of the conversation that you had with Gemma Cooper, where she said that, like, you know, look, you can't mention the name Marcel Yanka or you will get the sack. Mm-hmm. Did you ask her why you cannot discuss that person?
She said he's a very private person.
Right.
He doesn't like people talking about him, knowing much about him. He's a very nice person, but he's very private. So if you betray that, and basically he's paying you wages now, you'll get the sack. That was it.
I think. Okay, so that was the explanation, that he's a very private person and he doesn't want to be mentioned publicly.
And for a long time, we called him Voldemort, because in Harry Potter, you're not allowed to mention Voldemort's name. And so we just called him Voldemort, because, it was very, very strange, the whole thing. And
secret.
It was all a big secret, and I did have worries about Charles Malet, because he was also censoring my work that I was doing with the farmers. I was working with the farmers' protest, particularly the one that happened on Budget Day, and I know that Charles was not happy about my work with the farmers, because I did share that the farmers wanted the UK Column to live stream their side of the protest. And I went to the column and said, would you do it? Would you live stream? And I shared a little bit of information Charles Malet went ballistic and said we want nothing to do with it. And then when the protest,
why? What was the reason given? What was the reason given?
Well, the reason was he felt that they were being too too much activism. That he thought that they were going to be breaking the law.
Okay.
Because they'd been working with the Met Police to bring their tractors into Whitehall, and they'd been allowed permission to bring their tractors into Whitehall and to do what a sort of, not a French dirty protest, but they were allowed to dump, I think it was 6 tons of compost outside the gates of Number 10 in order that they could sweep it up later.
Right.
And they were.
So they literally had permission from the police, from from the Met Police. Okay.
But Charles didn't like the fact that they were operating independently, because there were other actors within the protest who are controlled opposition. I won't mention who.
Okay.
But Charles was working with them, and he didn't like the fact that I was working directly with the farmers, the real farmers, not the controlled opposition. And what happened is, the morning of the protest, and I know because there was one detail, and I won't mention what it is, there's one detail that I told Charles Malet that the farmers were going to do, and he went ballistic. And that morning of the protest, there were no tractors in Whitehall. When I got to the protest, I said to the farmers, why? What happened? And they said 5 o'clock last night, they pulled permission for us to bring our tractors into Whitehall. So they were told they could park their tractors. What do you do with a massive tractor in the middle of London? They were told they could park their tractors in Pall Mall and Trafalgar Square. And then they got seized by the police, 2,500 per tractor to release them from £1, to release them. And these poor farmers had come up because they're being battered with taxes, inheritance tax, with all sorts of, awful...
Those tractors were brought to London on the assumption, I guess, on the knowledge that they had permission for that.
They had permission, and it was pulled. The rug was pulled from underneath them at 5 o'clock the evening before, and then they were told they could park their tractors in the town, and then the police turned on them. And Charles Malet was the only person that knew that information, and I was deeply, deeply annoyed about it. And I suddenly thought, could it be that he had I don't know. I'm not pointing fingers, but it seems a coincidence that he was the only person I told about what they were doing and where they'd be and how they'd do it. And suddenly the Met Police pulled the rug from underneath them. And it just was awful. And on also that note, I also interviewed farmers at that protest and afterwards. And I put I did the interview with the farmers, and that interview I did on just after the 26th of November. By Christmas, that interview still had not been edited by the UK Column, and it didn't go up. And I said, look, it's losing traction. And they literally just didn't put it out. They did finally put a very heavily edited version up, because they said there were technical problems with it, but most of it wasn't in there. It was just, it wasn't what I'd recorded. Wow. And anyway, they and it went out weeks afterwards, so it lost its power. And that's when I left. I thought, I'm done with this. I'm done. Yeah.
All right. Well, there's a few. Quite a few tidbits of information here that I think people can draw their own conclusions from that. I just really try and keep it factual. And again, if anyone from UK Column wants to respond to that, definitely. When I publish this and when I publish the show notes, I'm happy to include that, or even happy to have an on-camera interview if they like. But look, on the face of it, there are some questions that are that need to be answered at the very least, because as a member-supported organization or as a member-supported media outlet, I think they're not. It's not a corporate. It's not they're backed supposedly predominantly by the members. I think there's some answers that need to be given here. That's probably all I will say. Look, so I guess that's with the UK Column side of things, but I guess let's move to the bigger picture of independent or alternative media in the UK. Obviously, it's quite a tumultuous time in the UK at the moment, with potentially early elections, potentially prime minister stepping down. over the weekend there was this like big rally, Unite the Kingdom, like with Stephen Yaxley Lennon, better known to everyone for some reason as Tommy Robinson. Like, what's your take on all of these events, and I guess the different angles of coverage that they receive from like different media outlets in the UK, alternative media outlets in the UK?
Well, I looking at these events and the people involved in them, you've got Tommy Robinson and Elon Musk, and the last one, Elon Musk came on the screen and that are inciting people to. I feel that they want rioting on our streets, and they want to bring in martial law, and that's the best way to do it, is divide the nation, get them fighting on the streets, and then bring in some kind of military operation to get everybody in order, and the whole digital ID thing they're trying to bring in. So I think with all these different parties, I mean, we were mentioning before, we've got Restore, we had Reclaim, we've got what's Farage's one?
Reform.
And we've had Advance, and all of them are pretty much the same, and they are literally, you might as well have the rinse and repeat party. That's the way I look at it. It's all the same, and they're all going the same way, and they're all backed, I think, by the same money, and really there is no choice. There's no choice here, and all of this, Restore's the one, don't vote Farage, vote Restore. It's all the same, and we've got to really try and get away from that whole political arena, and it should be people-led. I don't know how we're going to do it. I don't have the solutions to that. But all I know is that this is not the way to go with all of these incredibly, I mean, they're saying all what you think is the right thing. But if you look behind it, look at the financing. You've got it's technocratic. It's a whole technocratic, like Peter Deal and all of that kind of stuff. All that money is always at the end of it backing all of this, and so we've got to be very, very careful that we're not a pipe. I think they're pipe pipers leading us to.
I think very much. I follow Dr. David Hughes's 3 camps of awareness, and what he highlighted, which I think is so important, is that for mainstream media, the legacy media, as we call them, BBC, Sky, Channel 4, etc. Generally, who is funding them. Generally, you're aware of who is viewing them, what their viewing figures are. But like I said at the beginning, this explosion of alternative media, you've got these huge channels that have suddenly appeared from nowhere. And you have to ask yourself, why are they so big? Why have they got so much support? Who is behind them? Who is funding them? And you don't know, because Camp 2, which is how David Hughes acknowledges alternative media, Camp 2 is very, very opaque. There's no transparency. I mean, there's little transparency, but more transparency with legacy media than there is in alternative media. So you have to ask yourself, why have all of these media stations suddenly blown up, and who is behind them? With regards to the Tommy Robinson march, again, it's very interesting for me. Maybe I'm getting too cynical for my old age, but I felt that it was more of a trap, that this was a whole trap, that people were going to go down to London in good faith to be together, children, mums and dads, buggies, pushchairs, the whole lot, old people too, vulnerable people. We're all going to go down to London for a party, to be together, to unite the kingdom, for people not to feel alone, people not to feel isolated. But what it became very quickly to me, when the police announced that they were going to be putting live artificial facial recognition in for this protest, and not for the Free Palestine protest that was going on right next to it, in fact they were almost clashing, I started to be suspicious, because the previous digital ID protest had gone right past Scotland Yard with all the facial recognition cameras. And now you've got another protest that is being highlighted, not just by the Prime Minister, right-wing thugs, we were all called. Not that I attended, I wasn't able to, but if I had have attended, I'm certainly not a right-wing thug, or I don't see myself as a right-wing thug. So I felt that it was a trap. It was a big trap to get people together who they could facially recognize. They could harvest data from this. How many people turned up? Who were they? Who were the speakers? They made a really big deal out of it. So for me, it was all a trap. And I think it was interesting the way that certain names were used during the Unite the Kingdom protests. Like we saw Andrew Bridgen standing up and talking. Ben Habib was the only leader of a political party to turn up, although Rupert Lowe did post a picture of a Restore flag and said glorious, and I think Nigel Farage in some way tried to sort of make reference to it. But Monty Toms, who's a young up-and-coming citizen journalist, Will Coleshill, these were all people that were named, specifically named as part of the Tommy Robinson circus, if you like. I'm not saying that in a derogatory way. I'm just saying as a cumulative of the Tommy Robinson operation.
And also worked for UK Column. Also, both of those worked for UK Column.
Both worked for the UK Column. So I think when it comes to political parties in this country, Sandy's right, they're all the same. But the question is, and I think the question has to be, is who is funding these legacy, the alternative media that are pushing the narrative for these political parties? Where is the money coming from? And who is the propaganda wing of these particular, whether it's Restore, whether it's Reform, whether it's Reclaim, whether it's Advance, whether they're all in it together? Who is funding this huge operation? And that I haven't gotten to the bottom of yet.
Yeah, and that's always a challenge. I mean, that is just something that keeps coming. I mean, I keep coming across that pretty much in every country where you have like all these outlets where you don't know who's behind them, but all of a sudden, like they have a lot of presence and it's very polished and very clearly very well funded and clearly very well resourced. I mean, I guess one case study that I think it's kind of worth mentioning, and that's something that's kind of been on my radar for a long time because I'm kind of familiar with their previous incarnation, is an outlet by the name of Vox Populi. So I mean, they provided quite an extensive coverage of the Tommy Robinson rally. So let me just that's like, it was very obvious and it was like overwhelmingly very favorable, right? So let's have a look at that. It's not like you don't need to go like too far to see that,
Oh, that's Will Coleshill, who used to work for UK Column.
Yeah.
So there's several people that seem to be so Will Coleshill seems to be one. Then there's another German lady by the name of Vicky Richter that seems to be involved in the coverage, right? And it seems all. So the reason why I'm interested, for me particularly in that outlet, and maybe people in the UK don't know, but Vox Populi is actually a rebrand of an outlet that used to be called the Aussie Wire. There was, as you can imagine by the name, there was with an Australian focus, right? And it was headlined by a presenter called Topher Field, who's quite a prominent name in, I guess, the alternative media space or the freedom space in Australia. And it was rebranded to Vox Populi after Topher left. And also the focus kind of shifted away from Australia, predominantly to the UK. There seems to be a bit of a focus on America as well. So for example, Vicky Richter, I think, covered CPAC, the latest CPAC for Vox Populi from Texas, right? And all of a sudden, I mean, you see this outlet, and I mean, when they still had the studio and when they had studio broadcast, I mean, the studio was very professional and it was clearly very well set up. Right, so I thought, okay, well, let's have a look at who's actually behind this outlet. So on the website itself, there was nothing there was nothing at all to to indicate who's actually behind the outlet. But then I was able to come across someone by the name of Jonathan Wong. And Jonathan Wong, the reason why I came across him is because he actually says on his own Twitter profile that he's associated with Vox Populi, right? And then I came across an interview that Jonathan Wong has given to a gentleman by the name of Nick Buckley, who I think was at some point a candidate for reform, but I think maybe has since left the party, right? And he kind of he kind of spoke about before he started with Vox Populi, who still, he doesn't really say who's behind that outlet, but he used to work for an entity called the Lotus Eaters, which I understand, and I don't know, maybe you ladies can comment on that, but I understand that that's quite a prominent outlet in the UK. Do you know anything about that? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
so,
it's very well known. Anything you say, Sandy? But I certainly know it and watched it.
They're kind of they're very pro restore, to be honest.
Far right wing, yeah.
But and they're quite far right, quite far right wing, and they seem to really go along with this whole. But they're also, I mean, I do think a lot of them are still quite involved with the tech industry. You know,
okay.
Yeah.
But you found out something very interesting, didn't you, Michael? Because
I have indeed.
You shocked me, to be quite honest, and I think this will shock a lot of people in the UK.
As I said, I mean, I come into this completely cold. I'm not with from the UK. I'm not familiar with any of these outlets. But I mean, I always to kind of scroll and see, okay, well, what can they say about them, right? And when you scroll to the bottom of Lotus Eaters, there's an interesting thing here. So I don't know if you ladies can see that.
Restore Britain.
Yeah. So promoted by Lotus Eater Media Limited, and then they have their PO box, on behalf of Restore Britain. Suite 4, Millennium House, Gapton, and that's not a particular video, that's the website.
Yeah.
Wow. That's absolutely massive, because what you're saying there, Michael, basically is that the Lotus Eaters are the media propaganda arm for Restore Britain.
Yeah.
So I mean, you can say that, I don't know, propaganda. I wouldn't use the word propaganda, but I mean, they're obviously a media arm, and they disclosed it openly, to their credit, right? I mean, it's still at the footer, but it is a bit bizarre that supposedly a media arm associate themselves, and I think maybe they have to do it because, I don't know, maybe you're approaching an election year or whatever. I don't know, maybe they're required by law to do that. You would know better than me, but I just found it a bit bizarre, right? And then you look at Vox Populi and their very favorable coverage of United Kingdom, anything that Yaxi Lennon does, definitely anything that Rupert Lloyd's associated with, very favorable coverage. Right, and you start thinking, okay, well, Lotus Eaters, Vox Populi, are they associated somehow? And it's very hard to know because you don't know who's behind these outlets. Well, with Lotus Eaters, you kind of know. I think it's a gentleman by the name of Carl Benjamin, who started it in 2019. So at least here you have a name. But with Vox Populi, you don't even have a name, right? So I guess, this is just one example of, people need to, think and understand, well, maybe these outlets, they have an agenda, right? And again, to their credit, I want to give credit to the Lotus Eaters, at least they're not hiding, right? Okay, you have
no, they're not.
The bottom, but they are saying okay, well, we're Restore Britain, we are Restore Britain. So, and that's fine. And I think one of the contributors, a guy by the name of, so he's a guest contributor, so a guy by the name of Louis Brackpool, right? So on Lotus Eaters, he's presented as an independent journalist, reporter, and commentator, right? But when you go to his Twitter profile right now, it says Director of Investigations, Restore Britain. Okay, yeah. So I think that it's pretty obvious, right? So I mean, this is, I guess, an example where, with Lotus Eaters, again, to their credit, You don't have to dig too deep to understand, okay, well, who's behind them. So again, I want to give it to that credit. Please, like, they disclose that. But something like Vox Populi, still, I don't know who's behind them, right? What their agenda is, because it definitely seems like they do have an agenda, and their agenda is very similar to the one that Lotus Eaters have. So I guess this is just like a simple case study, and this applies not just to the UK. I mean, I'm in Australia, right? I mean, we have like, a rise of like, I guess a minor party called One Nation that all of a sudden like just exploded, and like, some polling even suggests that they like, they will form the next government, right? So they're going to be like the biggest party in parliament following the next federal elections. But all of a sudden stories come in that they're like, funded by certain people, like, Australia's richest woman, Gina Reinhardt, contributing like, private planes and all that sort of stuff. So people need to be, and like a lot of people even here in independent media, they just focus on the fact that, oh, finally we have like a minor party that is rising to prominence. It's like, the duopoly, the two-party system is broken. It's finally we have an alternative. Okay,
Yeah.
but maybe this is manufactured.
Everyone wants a hero, you see, and yeah.
So
Everyone's looking for someone to come in and save them as well. They're all looking for that
There is no-
identification. We identify with these people. These are the people on the street. But like Sandy said, and like you've said too, Michael, we seem to have gotten into, especially with the right, the right wing, if you like, of politics. We've got such a mishmash. Who is working with who? Are they all working together? Are they all working against one another? And you're right, to the credit of the Lotus Eaters, they have actually said that we support reform. Restore. But then that does add the question of, well, Vox Populi, who's the media arm for reform? Who's the media arm for advance? Are all of these people, Ben Habib and Rupert Lowe and Nigel Farage, are they all one entity, or are they fighting against each other, or are they united together? Because what we're seeing at the moment in the UK is, of course, we've got Makerfield election coming up with Andy Burnham, who's supposedly going to be running the country. I've got my own story about Andy Burnham, and Andy Burnham is not in my good books at all. He broke, as I was a government advisor for the Department of Health, I had a one-to-one meeting with Andy Burnham, and he broke every single promise to me. He never listened to me. He never got back to me. He never acknowledged me. So for me, he's a career politician. However, he's standing in a seat that is has got quite a big support from reform. So last night, Rupert Lowe announces that he's going to stand a candidate for Restore, which could potentially split the right vote and enable Andy Burnham to be crowned as the next prime minister, because that's what we're looking at. We're not looking at just somebody coming in to be a member of parliament. Wow. We're looking at the mayor of Manchester stepping down from his post and going for a parliamentary seat, and then going straight into the House of Commons as prime minister and sitting in 10 Downing Street. This is the gravity. This is the gravity of the situation we're at. So now we've got a political chess game of reform and restore against one another, against Andy Burnham, who could potentially, in the next few months, be our new prime minister. Wow. Where we are replacing one Fabian with another. Andy Burnham is the Fabian's local hero, so they're all members of the Fabian party. But that's what we're seeing on the right side of politics, is a complete, are they all together, are they split, what the hell is going on?
And can I add to that? Andy Burnham is part of the C40 Cities initiative to meet net zero by 2030. He is one of the directly elected mayors, or they call them the smart city mayors, the metro mayors, but they are the mayors, the global covenant of mayors for climate and energy, which they want to put in place in every single region and cookie cutter it in the UK, to dissolve Parliament altogether and to take over the implementation of anything to do with net zero before 2030 without recall to the people. So this is all about devolution, and I think Andy Burnham is really part of that whole thing. And they're saying, oh, he's old Labour. He's not. He's one of the covenant of smart city mayors. Really,
I think we're looking at federalism as well. I think there's a thin line between devolution and federalism.
Yes, which is what in 1998. Yeah.
Andy Burnham's done no favours for Manchester. I think most of the people of Manchester will agree to that. And also his cover-up of the Pakistani rape gangs, you know, the grooming gangs that have been going on. Andy Burnham has suddenly been elevated as Mr. Popular in the United Kingdom. He's not popular. He's really not. This is all a myth. Everybody else is being told that Andy Burnham is the next amazing Blairite, if you like. He's the next Mr. Popular Prime Minister. Nobody wants him as Prime Minister, or not. Nobody that I've spoken to wants him as Prime Minister in this country. So this is all just being hyped up.
Yeah. So I wasn't even aware of that, and I think for a lot of people in the UK, outside the UK, I think that's quite interesting, and just I guess maybe to explain it in a more structured way. So obviously, the current UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer is in a bit of a pickle, right? And there's rumors that he's going to step down, but that's not going to result necessarily in new elections. Just going to result in basically Labour getting a new leader, and just like it works always in the Westminster system, including in Australia, the leader of the biggest party in Parliament, right? They become the Prime Minister, right? So this Andy Burnham guy, it seems like there's like a concentrated effort to bring him from local politics into national politics, and then install him as leader of the Parliamentary Labour Party. And then if Keir
Can I just interrupt you there, Michael, very quickly, for people that don't know Andy Burnham. Andy Burnham he's been a career politician all his life. He was in the shadow cabinet. He was the shadow health secretary for a while. He's been in all sorts of different administrations. So he has been a minister. He has been a member of Parliament. He left Parliament to become the Mayor of Manchester. And now he's stepping away from the Mayor of Manchester to go back into politics, to go straight to number 10.
So what triggered this by-election? Like, I mean, obviously the sitting member had to, step down, right?
Oh, he did it. So the rumours are going in that Keir Starmer, you've got to go. Andy Burnham needs to get back. But everybody was saying, well, hang on a minute. You can't have Andy Burnham back in politics until he gets a parliamentary seat. Yeah. He's got to get a seat. So which seat will he get? So all the pundits were speculating he'll get this one, that one, the other one. And then all of a sudden, I think Josh Simons, I think his name is. He's not been in Parliament very long, and he's decided to just throw his cape down on the ground and let Andy Burnham have his seat. So he's stepping down in order to let Andy Burnham have this seat, or have a go at this seat. Now, what Josh Simons is going to get in return for that, whether a lord or he's going to get some honour, I don't know, or maybe a lot of money. I don't know what deal has been struck. But he has agreed to step down and let Andy Burnham fight. So this is all pre-arranged, pre-planned. And the reason that Andy Burnham says he wants to fight that seat is, as I said before, is particularly a strong reform population. So Andy Burnham says, if I get back into Parliament, I want to get in knowing that I was the best candidate. However, now that Rupert Lowe has put a candidate, or has announced that he's going to put a candidate up against reform, that could split the right vote, and Andy Burnham could actually get in, and then he will go straight to number 10.
Interesting strategy. I mean, you would think, obviously, like the guy who stepped down, what was his name again? Sorry, I forgot.
I think it was Josh Simons.
Okay.
But double check me on that.
No, that's okay. So let's say it's Josh. So obviously, when did he step down? Before, the last?
No, just now.
Just now. Okay. So obviously, there is a move underway. But I guess, from a strategy perspective, you'd think that, if they want to get this Andy Burnham into Parliament so that he can become leader and then Prime Minister, they would want a safer seat. Exactly.
Sure. But he said he specifically wants to fight a tough seat.
I see.
So that he knows that he gets in for the right reasons. However, I think Burnham, what Labour, aka the Fabian Party, what the Labour Party seem to be saying is, he is our best hope. Andy Burnham is our best hope. But it's a massive risk, because if Andy Burnham doesn't get this seat, then they've got nobody left on the sidelines. Literally, if that's their best hope, who's not even a parliamentarian at the moment, then they're done. And then eventually it'll be a general election, and that's when you could see the likes of Nigel Farage, in my opinion, God help us, but you might see the likes of Nigel Farage as our prime minister. And now you can start to see some people in alternative media, I won't name them, but I can start to see some people in alternative media now gravitating towards Nigel Farage, because they say that if Andy Burnham doesn't win this seat, we're going to possibly have a general election. So who knows? It's interesting times.
Interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, for me, obviously, I'm not from the UK, so I don't follow that closely. But it does seem like, Rupert Law is positioning himself as, like, the next prime minister.
Oh, yes.
How realistic do you think that is, like, or like, actually, like, happening?
Do you want to go first, Sandy?
Well, I'd like to say I know. I have no idea. It's almost like this arena. It's like throwing it up in the air and and see, sucking it and see, because actually anything could happen. We don't know, and that's the way I think we all feel. I mean, what do you feel about Restore, Debbie?
I feel that they're all the same. I can't support any of them, and I don't think Restore have got. I think there's a lot of talking, but it's a case of you've got to walk the walk, haven't you? It's not just about talking. And a lot of people go, yay, Rupert Lowe, Restore, we're going to vote Restore. How many people will actually come out? I'm not sure. A lot of people in this country are not voting because they don't feel that they have got anybody to vote for. And it was interesting listening to Tommy Robinson at the Unite the Rally, pleading with everybody, you must vote. And he said, I don't care who you vote for, Advance, Reform or Restore, but you've got to vote. You must vote. Everybody must vote. Well, I think a lot of the British
and then everyone was chanting Rupert, Rupert, Rupert in the background. So I think that video.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so as far as I'm concerned, will Restore get the seat at Makerfield? No, I don't believe they will. What will happen with Andy Burnham? It seems to me like the population in Makerfield don't like him. So a lot of them don't want to vote for him. So if he doesn't get elected through this, although I do believe things are rigged, if he doesn't get elected through this, Labour are done. Labour are done.
All right, well, that's interesting. It'll be definitely be an interesting election campaign in the UK, whether it's early or whether it's at a scheduled time. I mean, I can say the same definitely about the next election campaign in Australia. But I really of your view, Debbie, that from my perspective, I think this is all like stage managed. This is literally a movie, and there is a script. Like, the beginning, the middle, and the end. Maybe the middle not so much, but the beginning and the end is always pre-written in advance, and it is set in stone. And maybe Rupert knows something that we don't, because, like, he has information from, people who have access to some things that we don't have. But hey, I guess we'll all find out. But I guess just to end this conversation, I guess from my perspective, I guess what is the takeaway that you would you would give, I guess, for people in the UK and in general, like, when they approach the alternative media space, and there's clearly like a lot of toxicity, a lot of things that are happening beneath the surface that are not known, right, and that are quite concerning. I guess how can people navigate this very, very, I guess, treacherous and complicated media landscape?
I would say I'll go first in on this one. So I would say to be able to discern is it's a blessing. If you can try to discern and ask the questions, intentionality for me is everything. So I always say follow the money, but look at somebody and then think, who's paying you? Is there anybody telling you to say this? How big an outlet is it that you're watching? Because I'm seeing some of these broadcasters, they're huge, they've got great big studios, they've got huge audiences, they're going live here, there and everywhere. They seem to have got reporters, people on the ground. And you have to ask yourself, where is the money coming from? What is the intention behind it? For myself personally, I'm just a gobby granny who's only ever been in this or been kind of hoisted. Brian kind of almost, I won't say the word coerce, but he heavily persuaded me to join UK Column, despite me just wanting to stay behind the camera, to be honest. But I would say intention. I only wanted to report the news because I genuinely have, I'm thinking about my children, my grandchildren, what kind of future are we handing on to them? And Sandy and I in particular, you know, we've got, you won't mind me saying this, Sandy, but you know, we've got quite a few years life experience between us. So we remember what the NHS used to look like. We remember what life in the 70s, the 80s in Great Britain used to look like. And it's different and it's changed. The whole landscape's changed. The whole landscape of alternative media has changed. The whole landscape of politics has changed. So I would say to people, discern, try to discern, follow the money, find out. You can't, I'd say don't trust anybody except yourself, to be quite honest, at the moment, because we're living in such a crazy clown world. So you have to do, it's the old cliche of you've got to do your own research. And I'm afraid that is the case. We can only throw out red flags. But what Dr. David Hughes has always said is the 3 camps of awareness. Try and work out, that gives you a good grounding. Work out, are they camp 1? Are they camp 2? Or maybe a tiny little camp 3, where people haven't got any skin in the game. They're doing things for nothing. They're not asking for huge presentation fees. They're not asking for massive amount of fame and fortune. They're just doing it because they genuinely want to. Camp 3 is tiny. It's absolutely tiny. Camp 2 is probably bigger. The alternative media Camp 2 is probably bigger than Camp 1, even BBC, Sky, Channel 4, because it's grown exponentially. So I would say to anybody that's taking a journey into all of this for the first time is just tread carefully. Tread carefully, go with your gut feeling. I always go with my gut feeling. And if I've got red flags that are going doo, then I take notice. If I hear something 3 times in 24 hours that is the same, then I think that's a red flag. I need to go and look at that. So discernment, intentionality, and your gut feeling is what I would go with, and a prayer. Sandy?
Great tips.
Yeah. I feel the same way as Debbie, in as much as, you know, they're all, you know, they if you really want to do your research, if you're not sure, do your research, and yes, you do have to follow the money to a degree, and finding out who is funding these people. And from what I can see, there's a lot of funding coming from one place to all of these parties, which is really quite disturbing. And yet you have to be discerning as well. I mean, there was a thing going viral yesterday with a picture of Rupert Lowe, and he's in his office, he's doing some sort of podcast, and there's behind him is a picture, and they were saying that's a Freemasonic picture, but actually it's not. It's and I thought, well, I wonder if there's hype going on, putting labels on these people, and maybe some of them could be okay, but we don't know. We just don't know. And I'd like to find out who, you know, where the money is coming from, because I'm not defending Rupert Lowe in the least, but people can get the wrong end of the stick, and I would hate that to happen with some people. But you know, you look at all these parties, and they're all harping on to the nostalgic Britain or England as we know it, and there's a reason for that. It is a very, very emotive tool. It's all about nostalgic Britain, England, whatever, and restoring it to what it used to be, or reforming it to what it used to be, or, you know, in some way another,
advancing it to what it used to be,
or, you know, whatever it might be. And really, you know, it gets very emotive. It gets the emotions going. But we have to look at who is behind this, and we've got to really look at, is this a trap, as Debbie said? And I think really, I mean, even I haven't got to the bottom of it yet. And I think between us and with all the other wonderful researchers, we can get to the bottom of it. And maybe we can bring something together that isn't what they are going to present. Because I can't help thinking that you've got the whole technocratic, you know, legatum technocratic Peter Thiel, everything behind all of this, and it's presenting itself as something very nostalgic and good, but actually, is it taking us down the wrong way, the wrong alley? Yeah. So we just need to, again, pray and seek your own guidance within your heart, because that's the only thing we have.
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, I can definitely give ARC as an example, because I mean, on the face of it, initially it looked like, okay, back to conservative values. It's like, the antithesis to the WEF, or the World Economic Forum. And obviously, once you start digging, and you don't even need to dig very, very deep, you understand that there's like other things that are happening. And I think as this, I guess, it wasn't that obvious. I mean, it was fairly obvious in the first conference, but I mean, the last one with Peter Thiel speaking, with the head of Palantir in the UK, like the head of Palantir, come on, right?
Yeah.
I mean, okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think anyone, even people who were maybe initially fooled by what ARC is about and who's behind it and what its purpose is, I think it becomes fairly obvious. Ultimately, look, I think you both ladies, you both made like really good points. And I mean, from my perspective, it boils down to like, ultimately you have to think for yourself. There's no shortcuts. It's like with diet, or like, with exercise. You can read all the books and like learn all the hacks and like, take these pills and take these potions and buy these like dumbbells with like laser, like, whatever you want. But ultimately you still have to do the work. There's no shortcut. That's where it boils down to, for my perspective.
Exactly. Although I will say a little caveat for some people, because I'm very fortunate. I have the luxury in that I'm old, and that I haven't got young children running around. I haven't got to get out at work at 7:30 in the morning. I haven't got to worry about who's going to pay the kids' school lunches for the next month. I haven't got that worry because I'm older. So I have the time to do the research. I have the time to look at all of these names, to go with my gut feeling, to look at funding. I have a lot of time to do that. Sandy's the same. We have that luxury. If I turned the clock back 35 years, and I had 5 young children running around, and I had school runs and football matches and ballet lessons and partners to consider and school packed lunches to do, I would not have the time to be able to find out what people like you, I, and Sandy are finding out. So what I would say to people that are coming in new is, it is difficult to do the research yourself, because there are only so many hours in the day, and for some reason time seems to be speeding up. But just discern and look at Dr. David Hughes's 3 camps of awareness, and look at the personalities that are coming up through. What's their background? Where did they come from? What is their speciality? What is their area of expertise? That's what I would say do. But I do feel incredibly worried for the young families and the people that aren't able to do the intense research that we are able to do. So just keep an eye on everything, I'd say.
Yeah, no, look, it's a really, really good point. I guess the tip that I would say, look, I mean, yes, everything you say is like, it's a very valid point. But I mean, I guess life hack that you can use is, don't accept things at face value, and just think maybe the people who are telling me something, maybe they have an agenda, right? So I'll park it when I have more time. Maybe I don't have the time now, but I'm just not gonna take it straight from the screen into my brain and accept it as fact and as reality, because the people who are telling me this, they may have an agenda. And sometimes it's very, very important, to, even if you don't have the time, you have to think that maybe there's something else going on. And I think the last couple of years have proven that to us. People who've taken at face value everything that the TV was telling them, unfortunately, a lot of them paid with their lives. So it's very, very tragic, but that's the reality. So yeah, I guess if there's one thing that I guess we all learned during these years, is that there's interest in play that we may not be aware of. So even if people
question everything.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's question everything. I think that's a really, really good place to end it. Yeah, look, ladies, I think it was a very, very important conversation. I think some also about the, like, the factual information about, like, what happened at UK Column, your personal experiences. I think it's very important to put it in the open, and obviously people at UK Column are happy. I'm more than happy for them to respond, and I'll give their for the record responses as well. And I think it's also important for, like, the members and, like, the people who are reading and listening and watching UK Column to understand what was actually going on and, like, hear both sides of the story. Obviously, UK Column have given their side. I think you ladies have given your side. And as usual, I mean, that's what we end. Like, think for yourself and make your own conclusions, question everything, and, like, see who's got the interest here. Are these two ladies, like, what their interest is? What is the interest of UK Column? What is the interest of Marcel Yanka? We don't know. So yeah, that's probably a good place to end it. Thank you really for coming this morning. Morning for you, evening for me. And yeah, look forward to chatting again in the future.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for inviting us, and we're just saying hello to everyone in the Southern Hemisphere and sending lots of love from us in the UK all the way over to you.
Thank you, ladies. Thanks for coming on. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Bye-bye.